Bad Mondays. By Handyman. Chapter 28. A dark reflection. Something crunched under him as he stirred. The world begrudgingly came back into focus around him, with every movement felt heavy and sluggish. He was, unfortunately, all too familiar to waking up to pain these days. He knew he shouldn't dick around, however he was in a fight with a servant of the mistress no less. Thanks to his little issue with sleeping, he had no idea how long he had been out. Time was of the essence. He wanted to push himself up to get back in the fight, but found himself struggling to just roll over on the dry ground. "Hang on a minute," he grunted, pushing himself to his feet. He looked down. All he could see was the mist, but as it cleared, little by little, he could make out his feet and the dried leaves, twigs and broken acorn shells littering the ground underneath him. Speaking of the ground, he felt off balance, like he was on the side of a hill. "Whirlwind, where are we?" he called out hopefully. No answer. He turned about. He couldn't hear anything apart from the rustling of leaves and saw nothing but the same white mist. A dark shape nearby and a groan enlightened him to the fact that he, at least, was not entirely alone. He carefully picked his way through the mist towards where the sound came from and found the bundle of pony that was the false crimson curled up amongst the leaves against a rotten log, shivering, her torn saddlebag nearby. This only raised more questions. Where the hell were they? Where were the others? Why was everything so quiet? He waited, perhaps for half an hour, for the mist to clear. Eventually, the looming darkness of trees appeared around him. He craned his neck to look up at them but found he could not back away far enough to see their peak. They were impossibly tall. He was briefly reminded of the redwoods of California he had heard about and seen in pictures, such was their immensity. However, their trunks were nowhere near as thick, and they bent and contorted in the manner of smaller, wilder trees. Despite the all-encompassing canopy far above, the forest floor was not all that dark and brimmed with life. At least there was plenty of floral life. He still didn't hear anything. No bird song, no rustling pitter-patter of small animals, nothing. Just the movement of leaves. Crimson stirred, and Handy snapped back to attention. Carefully, and ignoring the aches he felt, he crouched down, pulling his dagger from the accoutrements at his belt. Mr. Thunder did a number on him apparently, vampirism or no. He sat down next to a tree and placed her up against it, a hand pinning her gently to the tree, the other ready with the sharp implement. Time to get some answers. The pony stirred, blinking her eyes awake. The pendant was flashing frantically at her chest. Handy suppressed a smile. "Looks like a certain someone is freaking out." The pony awoke with a whimper as she looked about with tired, bloodshot eyes, which widened when they saw Handy staring pitilessly back at them with his blank face of a helmet. She struggled, and he shoved, pressing against her and holding her against the tree as he brought his dagger up to her throat. "Where is Crimson?" he demanded. The pony blinked before pulling a faltering smile. What do you mean, sir?" "I'm RI," she cut off quickly as the dagger pressed ever so slightly against her throat. "She's safe," the impostor said. The pendant flashed a few times. "You should be thanking me." Handy just snarled at her in response. The pony's ears flicked, but otherwise she didn't flinch. "What gave me away?" she asked at last, and it was Handy's turn to smile. "Your blood smells wrong," he said. That certainly made her flinch. The pony was consumed by green fire, and Handy let his hand go of her with a yelp. Even though the flames licked his unarmored left hand, it didn't burn. Curious. The changeling sat on its haunches before him, its eyes obscured by the same blue covers he had seen all those months ago on the faces of the Queen's soldiers. The changeling seemed amused by the human's reaction, and the pendant flashed rapidly in a manner Handy associated with the Queen herself laughing. It flexed its insectoid wings, and Handy quickly shoved the creature back against the tree bark, the dagger once again at its neck. It didn't really resist. "What do you want with her, changeling?" he asked. It didn't respond, and Handy just grew angrier. Speak up, or I'll be eating changeling tonight. Well, I won't, really, but your blood on the other hand. We had to get close to you, the changeling said, almost too quickly, its ear flicking. Without alerting the griffins, it continued after the pendant flashed. It only seemed to speak after it flashed as if the queen herself was telling it what to say. Not only that, although it was hard to tell with the buzzing echo behind the creature's voice, the changeling sounded infuriatingly familiar. Why? A flash. Because it was necessary. Stop playing games with me, you fucking excuse for a fairy. Handy snarled. For all their resemblances to bug ponies, his first impression of the changelings was unlikely to change. Tell me the truth. And where do I know you from? He asked. Its ear flicked twice this time, its expression still stoic and unchanging. There were a few flashes from the pendant, and the changeling let out a short sigh. With a shifting noise, the eye covers retracted into barely perceptible slips in its skin, revealing its eyes. It's chartreuse eyes. Handy froze. No way. There was no way Chrysalis would send the one changeling he'd be only too happy to tear a new, structurally superfluous asshole to tail him. And she'd been there this whole time? Handy shook with fury, but the changeling held his gaze. Thorax, he almost spat out. Scratch that, I will have changeling tonight. Thorax's gaze faltered but then held firm. You wouldn't do that, she said, the pendant now flashing slowly. You wouldn't risk it. And how would you be able to know that? I don't, Thorax said, now looking distinctly uncomfortable, her eyes looking downward as the pendant flashed more rapidly. But my queen does. She wants to speak to you. I don't exactly see her around. No, she wants. Thorax shifted uncomfortably, groaning and clenching her teeth. Her eyes screwed shut as she shuddered. To speak to you, to speak. Her eyes opened with a flash, and there was a dull, bluish glow from the whites of her eyes. Her irises were no longer chartreuse, they were instead a deep, dark green surrounded by a ring of lighter, yellowish green with thin black slits for pupils. Now! Rumbled out the distinct, two-toned voice of the changeling queen from Thorax's mouth. The changeling grinned, looking back at the human with a determined expression. It really has been too long, heartless. The hairs on the back of Handy's neck stood on end as his skin crawled. How in the hell did she do that? Was it the pendant? Could she have done that to him at any time? Chrysalis, Handy said lowly. The queen herself was right here at his fingertips once more. In a manner of speaking. Oh? None of your excessive formalities? Really now, I'm wounded. What are you talking about? What do you want? A lot of things, little human, she said, a teasing tone in her voice which only served to annoy Handy further. Oddly enough, he found himself looking away from her eyes more often than not, thankful for the anonymity afforded by his helmet as uncomfortable memories surfaced of what he had almost done to her. But that was then, this was now, and he forced himself to meet her gaze. And I was ever so hopeful I could have done all I wanted to do without you being any the wiser until I returned your precious little mage to you. Handy almost rose to that bait. He could have demanded to know where she had placed Crimson, but showing weakness in front of the queen of the changelings struck him as a terrible idea. Alas, Chrysalis continued, frowning slightly as she studied him. Things did not turn out as desired, and here we are. She looked around. Wherever we are. What was it your, little dear friend called it? The Green Woods? I guess as much judging by these trees, never managed to get any changelings into this place. I wonder if the legends are true. I am growing tired of this, Handy said truthfully with an exasperated noise. He pushed down harder on Thorax's body and pressed his dagger just a bit more against her throat. Chrysalis turned her head around to face him once more. Yo! I have her! You know, the unicorn, Chrysalis said, almost bored, her eyes half-lidded, her raised eyebrows, and slanted frown indicating she really couldn't care less for the human's anger right now. She simply wasn't intimidated. The one you swore to protect, she smiled, after that simply delightful touch of manipulation you pulled in that inn. Really, I had chills watching that. I don't particularly care. Oh, I think you do, heartless, she crooned, leaning forward, forcing Handy to withdraw his dagger bit by bit so as to not cut her inadvertently. I've watched you for a long time, remember? Seen things through your eyes, heard what you heard, and enjoyed every moment of it. And oh, how you made Celestia's brat squirm, using your fascinating story of your homeland to lull her into a false sense of security. Simply delicious. Every lie, every half-truth, the way you looked at the corpse of Prince, oh what's his name? Right, Jeffrey. The bird you murdered. Handy flinched. You weren't wearing the pendant that night, but it was easy to put two and two together. I still heard everything while the pendant sat in your room. It really didn't take me long. What of it? Handy said, not liking where she was going with this. I just found it amusing how you insist on King Johann trusting you, even though you didn't have the heart to tell him who really killed his brother that night. He probably already worked it out, Handy said defensively. He's smart enough to. Jeffrey's days were numbered anyway. Then surely you must share everything with him, HMM? Like how you knew I could see everything through this pendant. What are you getting at? Handy said, pushing her back against the tree with both hands. Chrysalis winced with the impact. That was interesting. She could feel what Thorax felt while she was in control of her. Temper, human. Chrysalis was still smiling, grinning even. What I am saying is that we have a lot more in common than you'd like to think. I have nothing in common with you, Faye. Really now? I was there when you transformed. I was there when you fed. I saw the way you looked at ponies ever since, as much as you may want to deny it and stick to your little casks of animal blood. You need to take from others to survive, just like us. You lie, you cheat, you steal, you use others, perhaps not as much as changelings must do, but enough that we can see a kindred spirit. She paused. But not entirely. You see, I did notice something else about you. And what, pray tell, would that be? Handy asked, angry yet unnerved by the changeling's analysis of him. He placed the blade against her throat once more. You keep your promises, she said smugly, even when they are inherently disadvantageous to you. Even when it would be easier to slip away and ignore it, or did I imagine your whole consenting to be King Johann's indentured servant because of a broken promise? That was something entirely different. I had other reasons to go through with that. Ah yes, you swore to your God. How very religious of you. Then tell me, heartless. She leaned up again, and again Handy was forced to avoid cutting her throat prematurely. Would you then willingly go back on your promise to whittle Crimson, she asked, placing a hold hoof on the human's fist which held the blade, by killing my little soldier and thus forcing me to harm her? There was a long pause and a conflicted expression on the human's face. Eventually, however, he pulled his knife away, Thorax's hoof following his hand until it was out of reach. She smiled triumphantly. Good boy, she cooed. You could not have known I'd do that, Handy tried to say in his defense. Oh, but I did. I did ever since you had that delightful discussion with Crimson about how to send you home. Simply fascinating, I must admit. You found out she had the means to send you to your little, rainy, island home, all the way on the far side of the world through this veil nonsense, but you didn't let her because it would harm her. How sweet of you, heartless. Handy's mind raced, recalling everything he had discussed about how he got here with Crimson. He knew he was from another world. Crimson definitely knew, but he didn't recall either of them explicitly stating that while wearing the pendant. She doesn't know yet. She still thinks I'm from this world, or she's pretending to for some reason. That could be useful to him, even though he didn't know how to use that right now. What do you want with her? Her? She asked, eyes wide in mock innocence. Why, nothing. Handy rephrased his question. What do you want with me? There you go. She said before looking to the side, idly studying their surroundings. A little bird told us something we need was in the possession of certain ponies who were also very interested in a certain human and that they might rear their heads at the festival. We needed a way in, if only to just identify who these ponies were and then track them down ourselves, and a way to stick close to you. She placed a hoof on his chest which he batted it away in irritation. She merely chuckled, to ensure we found them. Imagine our surprise that it was this same mistress your little crimson friend feared, and it was her they sought and that crown you took off of fancy pants they were after. All very interesting. I believe I'll have a few lings pay Mr. Fancy Pants a visit sometime soon. You really know how to end up right at the center of a web, don't you, Heartless? And I intend to exploit it. So that's why you took Crimson. Yes. As interesting as it would be to hold on to her and learn her magics, I fully intended to leave her back in your care when I was done, she said. Handy just looked at her with an unamused expression, and she blinked. Honest. I had no intention of ever having to meet you in person again, but circumstances being what they are, I think I'll hold on to her for a while. Collateral, you understand. You know I'll just come find her. Oh yes, which is why I'm going to make a deal with you. No deal. You release her now, or I kill this little changeling in front of me that you happen to be puppeteering. Oh, but then I'll have to respond in kind, Chrysalis said with a pout. Wouldn't that just be terrible? You'd sacrifice your soldier this willingly. Heartless, she volunteered. She knew the risks, she said. Now, here's what I offer you, I will release your pony, unharmed, if you agree to find me what I seek from those you were going to hunt down anyway. I'll even pay you. I know how much you like our gold, and we do ever have so much of it which we aren't using. Why would I ever agree to that? Handy asked. I can't trust you to hold up your end of the bargain. Not even on my word as queen? She asked, looking at him sideways. Handy's helmet betrayed nothing. She smiled, rolling her eyes and letting out an exaggerated sigh. Oh, what to do, what to do? It would seem we cannot come to trust one another as we have no means of assuring the other will keep their word. Here it comes, the typical what choice do you have shtick where the party who thought they had the advantage tried to strong-arm the other into doing what they wanted. Handy had a retort for that, and he was ready and willing to. I suppose I have no choice but to place myself under a gaze now, don't I? She asked. That took Handy off guard. A what? A geese, Chrysalis said smilingly, a kind of magi. I know what a geese is, Handy said, wanting to pinch the bridge of his nose. The Fey comparison was becoming more and more apt the more and more he learned about these changelings. In Ireland, it was just a part of the numerous tales and mythos of the good people. Here in this world? It almost certainly was a very real thing. Why would I agree to verbal slavery? Why, Handy, that's only if you break your promise, Chrysalis said. And it applies to me as much as to you. Would you not say that's a good way to make me keep my word? I'm being awful generous to you here. Why would you risk it? Handy asked. She smiled. I just have good reason to be confident. I fully intend to keep my word. This is just my way of proving it to you, and ensuring you keep yours. I thought you trusted me to keep my promises. There's nothing wrong with a little extra insurance, is there? But your magic doesn't affect me. Just because I cannot feed from your heart nor affect your mind does not mean I cannot tie you to your own words. Aegis works differently from other changeling magic. Her smile disappeared, and she looked at him with a serious expression. You're already going after these ponies. This is just my way of ensuring I get what I want out of it and your way of keeping your promise to the unicorn. At the expense of my freedom. Only if you break it, she sing-songed, otherwise you're as free as you ever were. Handy thought for a good, long while. He was livid, and it must have shown as she began smiling more broadly. Chrysalis had him. He couldn't just walk away from this, not when she had crimson. He needed the mare, she was his only definite ticket home if he ever got callous enough to exploit her submissiveness to spend more of her lifespan getting him home. More than that, if he didn't, she was his only reliable knowledgeable source on old magic, which apparently, he was woefully underprepared to face in a fight. Chrysalis was also lying, she had to be. What else was she getting out of this? She led him right into this trap with the geese, knowing full well he wouldn't trust her at her word. Why risk binding herself as well? Why would she want to do this? It couldn't be as simple as she said. What was he not seeing here? How does this geese work? He asked at last. You need to just look deep into my eyes, she said, her tone turning velvety, clearly enjoying this altercation. Come on. Just do it and we can get a move on. Handy looked off to the side for some time, the changeling in front of him humming complacently. Sighing, he took off his helmet, eventually complying and looked the changeling in the eyes. That was when the rest of the world disappeared. All he could see were chrysalis eyes and darkness around them. The eyes flashed periodically, and the darkness pulsed and distorted in tandem. He could hear her voice, but oddly enough, it was not the two tones he was used to hearing. It was normal, almost. She insisted on speaking in that same, seductive tone, and he found he couldn't look away. Do you wish to make a deal with me, Handy the Milesian? She asked as the eyes pulsed, her voice like honey, worming into his ears, gently nudging, urging with an almost physical force. Handy felt compelled to reply but forced himself to take his time, to pick his words carefully. In legends, geeses always worked out badly for the human because they fucked it up, didn't foresee pitfalls in the phase wordplay, or let their mouths write checks they couldn't cash. Handy was all too aware how fond his mouth was of doing that last mistake and was determined to prevent that from happening. I wish to make such a deal with you, Queen Chrysalis of the Changelings, he said. Chrysalis laughed at that, the sound ringing like crystal glass, glittering and beautiful. He grit his teeth, trying to concentrate his thoughts but finding it difficult. What do you wish to trade? I do not wish to trade. I wish to make a promise for a promise, he replied. Chrysalis was silent for a moment. Her eyes and the blackness pulsed as they slowly drew nearer. The distortion of the surrounding darkness adopted a texture not unlike static, and his eyes hurt when he focused on his peripheral vision. Any attempt to focus away from her eyes was frustrated. What do you promise? If Queen Chrysalis promises to release the unicorn mare, Crimson Shade, unharmed from her possession and does so immediately. He heard a harumph coming from the queen and felt himself move, almost as if he fell back a short distance, but could not be sure. I promise to retrieve for her that which she seeks from the one known as the mistress and her servants. The last part was painfully vague, and Handy cursed himself for not having Chrysalis specify what it was she sought. His first mistake, he now realized, was initiating the deal himself. While successfully deflecting Chrysalis' attempts to steer the conversation, he had only ended up being forced to specify what he was willing to do for her first. The eyes continued to pulse and seemed to be getting steadily closer as they spoke. Handy felt beads of sweat break out on his forehead, a strange heat flushing his head. Was this the magic at work? I will agree to this promise for a promise, Chrysalis said, her eyes barely inches away from his own, her voice ringing clear and increasing in intensity. Every word felt layered, heavy, authoritative, but still retaining that frustratingly seductive quality. If Handy the Milesian agrees never to lay harm to me again. Ah, so that was it. The catch. She was still hung up on the shock treatment he had given her all that while ago. He could agree to that. And to return what I seek to me, personally. Well, damn. I will agree to this if Chrysalis, in turn, promises not to harm me, or mine, he said as the eyes were almost entirely upon him, filling his vision. The heat on his face increased, and he realized he could smell something akin to freshly cut grass and honeysuckle. He felt a weight press down on his chest and her laughter was like gentle dewfall. God damn, he felt the familiar throbbing in his head whenever something ever tried affecting his mind, knowing that whatever effect this magic was having on him, it was mitigated and lessened because of whatever God-blessed stroke of luck prevented him from being putty in her hooves. He had already struggled to keep his thoughts straight. He'd hate to see what it would be like if he didn't have any defense against their magic at all. Done, Chrysalis said at length. He felt breath hit his face as his vision was entirely consumed by the sea of green from her own eyes. Green which turned to a blue-tinged white surrounding her irises as the world returned, the sudden return of light almost a shock. He found himself resting back on the ground on his elbows, nose to nose with the changeling who pressed down on his chest. Was that so terrible? She asked, a devious smile on her possessed muzzle. Handy's eyes widened in alarm. Get off, Handy said threateningly, more than a little uncomfortable by her proximity. Is that any way to speak to your queen? She asked, raising a hoof to Thorax's barrel. Handy shifted his weight, forcing the changeling off of him as he got to his knees and then to his feet. She stumbled a bit before righting herself on her hooves. You are not my queen, he said, earning him a laugh. Oh, but would it be so terrible if I were? I understand how you feel. Do not assume. Save us both the bother. You are just like us, heartless. You feed on others, you take from them what you need and grow stronger because of it. I am nothing like you. Is that what you think? And what, pray tell, do you have in common with ponies more than us? Or griffins? They will not accept what you are, or what you need to do to survive. You helped us get our city back, you saved several of my changelings from captivity. You can make a good case for yourself here, with us. Enough. Come now, don't be like that, she cooed. I hardly ever tried to kill you after what you did to me, not even a little bit after you survived the Badlands. You impressed me, so surely you can. Enough, Handy said. Had it ended there, had Chrysalis stopped her goading, he may have come to terms with what she was saying and dismissed it for the clear attempt at manipulation that it was. He would have calmed down. She did not, however, and slowly he began tuning out what she said, but the buzzing two-tone sound of her voice grated on his ever-fraying nerves as he paced before the changeling. She was enjoying antagonizing the human, switching to insults when goading him about his nature didn't prove enough to get him to react, pausing only once to wince as she nicked Thorax's fetlock on a nearby bramble. And after everything that happened that day, as much as he would have given anything to have just been left in peace to sort out his thoughts, he found himself struggling to keep down his anger but found he couldn't bring himself to think of harming the queen. No, there was something different this time. This wasn't his usual guilt. He literally could not think about it, the thoughts melting away and his anger fizzling to nothing. He stopped mid-pace and looked confused. Chrysalis smiled. Something the matter, heartless? Handy shot her a glare, and her toothy grin widened. Certain thoughts coming to mind? Or rather not, I'd imagine. What did you do? What did you do? She parroted, breaking out into a laugh. That's how the geese works, human. No matter who initiates the spell, it's a two-way street. I bind myself to my words and you bind yourself to yours. I just wanted to make a little demonstration to show you how it works. By pissing me off. A crude way to put it, but yes, she said before her grin fell to a mere smirk. Handy just stopped and stared at the changeling for some time as she continued blathering on, preening, gloating about how much she was enjoying the shoe being on the other hoof. He wasn't paying too much attention. Now, dear reader, put yourself in Handy's boots for the time being. For the most part, on the sheer balance of things, he'd been having, for lack of a better word, a rather excellent week. Plenty of chances to blow off steam in a violent manner? Check. Time off duty? Check. Petty vengeance on a smarmy princely bastard? Check and check. Then, in the course of a single day, he lost his favorite cloak, which was literally the best cloak, he got axed in the back, and got a close and personal experience of what it was like to be dying slowly and painfully. He also got a better appreciation of how easy it could be for his vampiric nature to outright usurp control of his body, or drive him mad with fear. Which meant he was long overdue for a good hard look in the mirror in his near future about exactly what he was, which he was not looking forward to. He had the shit thoroughly kicked out of him, by a wizard no less, magic-resistant armor be damned. And now he was in the middle of God only knows where, hopefully only miles away from festival grounds where, you know, all of his money and goods were. And his friends and his king had no fucking idea where he was. He had his freedom of thought and action suburned by agreeing to a fey spell he had tied himself to in order to safeguard Crimson's release so that his one and only sure link to the mistress and her magics, which he needed now more than ever, wasn't lost to him. And now, the person responsible for that last addition to the shit heap that thoroughly ruined Handy's mood was tittering at him like a schoolgirl. And you know what? Fuck that. If she wants to fight wits with wits, then two can play at that game, Handy thought viciously. She had been acting creepy this entire time, obviously enjoying putting the human on the back foot. Turnabout was fair play. Earlier she cut her fetlock. She felt thorax's pain. She feels whatever she feels. You know, had she sent some nameless changeling that I didn't know, I might feel guilty about this next part, he thought, grimly remembering how Thorax had kidnapped him and the pleasant stay he had had in the changeling's care as a result. But seeing as it's this particular one. He started laughing. Chrysalis' ear flicked. What's so funny? You know, Handy said, crouching down till he was eye level with the changeling Chrysalis had possessed. You should really think your deals through more clearly, he said. She narrowed her eyes at him. That's generally what one does when you make a geese, human. Chrysalis deadpanned. I didn't put in any obligations I did not want. I know, I'm just saying, he said as he placed his hands on her withers. What are you doing? She asked, eyes darting to the hands as she raised a hoof to her barrel. Proving a point, Handy said, smiling lightly. Particularly yours. What? You say I'm like you, right? More than I'd like? Deceptive, sneaky. What are you getting at? She asked, turning her head to the side, looking at the human suspiciously. He was quiet for a moment, not directly answering the question. Casually eyeing a certain piece of her anatomy, almost admiringly. You know, you have such a lovely neck, he said, eyeing the body part in question. She cocked an eyebrow at him. It's not she said before her eyes widened in comprehension. Handy's smile widened, revealing his two little friends. That's what's so funny. Dash. She gasped as she shot up in bed, eyes wide and darting. My queen. Ah. The nursemaid yelped, sending a silver tray with some kind of soup sitting atop of it clattering to the floor. She bowed low to the ground, covers sliding into place over her eyes, staring up at the queen's eyes when she yelled at you being an immense faux pas in changeling society. Also, that only applied when she yelled at you specifically. At anyone else, or at the room in general, you were solid. So that was why when her sovereign queen shot upright in bed, screaming, the nursemaid barely blinked. Someone else's pain really wasn't their concern unless food was involved. However, if she was yelling at you? On your knees, mother bucker. Changelings. Chrysalis ignored her, instead wondering when the hell she had gotten into bed and why was the side of her face warm. She lifted a hoof to wipe the drool from her muzzle. God, she was glad no one else was around to see that. The nurse was bad enough. What happened? She demanded, glancing around her bedchambers. Everything seemed to be in place, but that wasn't the reason she was looking around imperiously as she got up from the bed. My queen, you should probably rest. What happened? The queen repeated more forcefully, trying to hide the nervousness in her voice. Okay. Okay, I'm back, this is my body, this is the palace, this is Lepidopolis. I'm fine, she reassured herself, idly checking a few things, moving odds and ends around with her hooves, just to prove she could. She had tried possession several times before using similar pendants in her most trusted changeling guards. There was always a sense of disorientation when she got back into her body, but she had never felt anything this intense. It was all she could do to keep her composure and not freak out. Why, you were found on the floor by your viewing crystal, the nursemaid said, pointing a hoof to the crystal orb in one corner. Chrysalis looked. It was still glowing blue. Squinting, she noticed a few telltale floating patterns within the crystal made up of magical light. It took practice to read, but it meant that Thorax was still alive, at least for now. That bucking human. She ground her teeth as she idly rubbed the side of her neck, the phantom feeling of 2 puncture wounds fresh in her memory but, thankfully, absent from her dermis. Why, your Ling servant discovered you this morning. You had been asleep for some time. My lady, are you all right? The nurse shut her mouth quickly and slid her covers back over her eyes once more as the queen looked at her. The nurse's mane had been curled up in a bun on top of her head. Not being a soldier, she, like most changeling civilians, didn't have to shave their manes and tails off. I am fine, the queen insisted with finality. The nurse made to inquire further but ceased as Chrysalis maintained her glare. Why yes, my queen. My apologies. I'll clean up and go. See that you do, she replied as the servant bowed before cleaning up the fallen soup and hurrying out of the chambers. As she left, Chrysalis closed the doors with her magic. Turning, she closed the doors leading to a balcony and drew the drapes. One more spell, and the room was silenced. No one would hear her for the next hour. She couldn't afford anyone finding out about what she was going to do next. She took a deep breath to calm herself at last as she gathered her thoughts. And then Chrysalis squealed like a filly covered in worms, hopping from one hoof to the next. Stupid, blithering ape! How dare he! She fumed, shivering, rubbing the sides of her neck with her 4 hooves. Of course there would be something she had to overlook. It was too good an opportunity to miss that she didn't even consider that he'd figure some way to get back at her. She had felt everything, absolutely everything Thorax did when he sank his fangs. She shivered. It was surprisingly pleasant, which just made it so much weirder. Changeling fangs did not do that to a LNG after all. She had largely come to terms with her feelings of fear towards the human, having watched him and learned that he did, in fact, have some semblance of guilt over what he had done to her. He had a weakness, something she could exploit, and that had given her confidence. Confidence enough that when her plans went awry, she had taken the opportunity to face the human, look him in the eye, and bend him to her will. Well, that and to prevent him from killing one of her changelings, but no Ling needed to know about that little motivation. All that, only to have him turn on her, a bolt of terror shooting down her spine when she realized what he was doing. A veritable nightmare coming to fruition. It wasn't nearly as bad as she thought it'd be, to be honest. She shook her head to dispel the thought and snarled. He thought he was so clever? Fine, maybe she would give the order to have that precious unicorn of his shaved, and that was just for starters, then she could. She felt the thoughts melt away and the anger fueling them evaporate. She blinked dumbly in confusion before letting out a strangled noise in raw frustration and flipping over a vanity table with her magic. Crack! Of course the keys would still be intact. That little She shook with fury, rearing up and shaking her forehooves impotently, her breathing deep and hurried before calming down. She sat on her haunches, idly rubbing the side of her neck as she looked at the fallen mirror on the ground that thankfully hadn't shattered. She bore a thoughtful expression as she brought her hoof away from her neck and looked at it, contemplating. A small smile crept across her muzzle. "It's fine," she said to herself, thoughts swarming in her head. "Everything is just fine." The gaze was quite clear where it mattered. Whether he wanted to or not, the human would bring her that which she sought from the mistress. In person. Then she would be able to secure her position as rightful queen now that all those pretenders from rival colonies were landing in Lepidopolis. The human would regret that stunt of his in due time, she would make certain of that. For now, however, he was useful. "Yes," she said quietly, idly rubbing her neck again as she looked out the balcony window, the narrow slit afforded by her closed curtains giving her a limited vision of the lit up, very much alive city below. "It'll be just fine. Dash equals dash." Well, he could rule out the possibility that he was anywhere near Ironcrest anymore. He had seen the countryside from the airship when they had arrived. There were no forests anywhere nearby that had trees this huge. Or could have possibly been this quiet. There was no way this forest wouldn't be crawling with griffins after that debacle if it was anywhere nearby, and the forest on the festival grounds was far too small to compare to this place. He looked up to the expanse of the canopy above him. Somehow, the moonlight still shone through that impenetrable expanse of black, casting the undergrowth in subtle hues of blue and gentle greys and causing the crystal-clear water of the pond next to him to sparkle and dance as the remnants of the mist that earlier pervaded everything clung to the ground, ghostly fingers tickling the surface of the earth and swimming between the roots and stones. Not that he could appreciate it at that moment. He had left her there, setting her down near the pond, having used the rags he had covered his arm and back with to tie her hooves. She wasn't going anywhere. He had waited for the fog to lift enough that he wouldn't lose her location as he crested the hill to get his bearings. Yep, he sure was lost. Nothing but endless forest wherever he looked. He called out, to see if anyone could hear him, but got nothing in response. Not even the sound of disturbed animals. That was eerie. No birds, no rustling of the underbrush, no buzz of insects, nothing but the swaying of leaves. He felt uncomfortably aware of how devoid of life this part of the forest was. He could tell where Thorax lay, even though the hill now stood between the two. He could feel where she was, a strange, burning sensation that pulled him. No, that wasn't the right phrase. It was more akin to a pinch that only let up when he turned in her direction. Was this an effect of changeling blood? It probably was. He couldn't make out anything distinct other than her location and her condition, which was slightly agitated sleep. He huffed and turned away, walking. He was done with today, in so many ways. He was tired, yet thanks to his little snack, sleep wouldn't be coming for some time yet. It had tasted like licorice, if you must know, with a tangy, sizzling aftertaste and gave him a burning sensation in his head. He was reminded of the pungent smell of fecund earth after rainfall and the smell of strawberries. This was honestly one of the strangest things about his condition, he decided, the tastes, the smells which only came to him when he was drinking, the feeling he got in his mind's eye. He figured he was only making these connections as the closest reference his mind had to what he was experiencing. Or at least he hoped that to be the case. It didn't make sense otherwise, but it was still strange as all hell. What was interesting was that despite being able to feel Thorax's presence, he didn't particularly feel all that much stronger. He certainly didn't move nearly as fast as he would with other blood or perceive as much. Certainly, all these abilities were heightened more than he was naturally capable of, but the effect was woefully under par by comparison. He could feel the difference based on the residual thestral blood still in his system. Although, he felt possessed of a strange confidence that he couldn't quite place, a surety of purpose and direction, which was ironic since he was pretty damn lost. Whatever, it had tasted good, he felt refreshed and full of life, and he got one over on Chrysalis. He could deal with not having any impressive powers this time around. And with those thoughts, his mood darkened and his pace quickened. The creeping fog grew thicker and rose ever so slightly as he walked. The Queen's words weighed down on him as he went, and as good as it felt to knock her down a peg or two, that little stunt of his it just proved her right, now didn't it? He was sickened with himself. The Queen had hit closer to home than he ever cared to admit, and it had only been a day or so since he had actually contemplated engaging in, for lack of a better term, hunting. The temptation of drinking living blood was it was intoxicating. He would often find himself grimacing and thinking about it each time he partook of an animal's blood to satiate the lust, recollecting the immense satisfaction and pleasure it gave him when he took from another living person. The intensity of the moment as he scraped his fangs along skin, searching for what he knew to be there, relishing in the anticipation, enjoying the apprehension and shuddering fear of those underneath him as he prepared to feed. It was exhilarating. Their thrilling gasp of pain and shock as his fangs puncture skin and artery, the jolt of their bodies underneath him as they froze stiffly before relaxing, melting away into his embrace as he drank deeply, greedily, hungrily, each ounce of vital essence a shot of ecstasy through his own body. Every intake of breath through his nostrils filled him with the scent of their spilled blood, sending him wild. The smells, the feeling, the sheer psychic rush that flooded his intellect, the primal euphoria as something wild within him was sated by the barbarism. The raw pleasure he felt as he took from them. How easy it would be, how often he longed for it, how often he pushed those thoughts, those desires to the back of his mind, out of sight where he could not think of it. How he could not bear to dwell on how good it felt, on his shame at how much he enjoyed it all. How easy it would have been, he wondered, to have bitten short beak. She had been right there, curled up against him, inebriated, sleeping peacefully as he had listened to the steady, rhythmic pumping of the blood through her veins. How easily he could have just bent down, opened his jaws, and just taken from her. Wondering how she would taste, how she would have felt. How he had to suppress that very thought on the night beneath an avalanche of raw guilt and self-hatred. How much had he wanted it anyway? How tempting, how easy it would have been, to take from that young alicorn when he had her right where he wanted her. After having spent hours getting her alone and compromising how she felt so that she wouldn't have been in a position to resist had he actually went for it. He had a goal that day, he achieved it by scaring her, but the temptation to have gone further was, almost overpowering. It was there, always, at the back of his mind, lurking, waiting, contemplating, wondering, surfacing only from time to time. Forcefully when he was hungry, willingly when he had fed recently such as right now. Always thinking, always wondering. When he was in the bookstore in Canterlot. The mare behind the counter. On the train to a friender. The distracted stewardess. The young griffin lass by the window seat. In the witch's hut in the cavern beneath the farm. The irritable countess he had dealt in the course of his duties as sword of the king. The butcher, the baker, the alchemist. The young servant griffin he had held under his cloak as the dragon fire had burned down the refreshment tent around them. The injured mare in the burning arena with the emerald eyes. It was there. It was always there. It had never gone away, no matter how successfully he had ignored it. It was a part of him. It was him. And Chrysalis saw that, she used that to get under his skin, and he hated her for dredging it to the forefront of his mind. But now that it was here, he was having a harder time dismissing the thoughts. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to, not after what he had done. To think Joachim had warned him against taking from any more living people, for both his sake and theirs. What did he know? He had no right to demand that of him. So what if he was his king? He could do as he wished and damn the consequences. He had needs and he shouldn't be restricted from the nectar of life and subsist on living off of the dredges of butcher shops because of the fear of a bunch of walking wineskins. That's what they really were in the end, weren't they? His friends, his servants, and the people he knew, they were food to him, and no amount of pleasantries and civilization was going to change that. They were food, they were power, it was his pleasure, and his right to take from them what he needed, what he wanted, to lose himself in the act and reap the spoils it gave him. In fact, why didn't he do just that? Thorax was still back there. She still had plenty of blood left, he had made sure of that. He contemplated doing it, relishing in the feeling of the changeling when he fed on her, the unique, elastic texture of the strange pseudo skin they had. The feeling of shock and fear giving way weakly to acceptance, the immense rush as he feasted on her blood, the memory of it still fresh in his mind's eye, the sheer thrill of it. How he didn't want to stop, the dark temptation to drain her dry, sucking every precious milliliter of her life's blood until he felt her heart give out. ===. It took him a while to register the pain in his unarmored left fist. It was caked in his own blood, despite that his wounds had healed over near instantly. He had spent the better part of half an hour punching an indention in the ancient, unyielding wood of the tree. He hadn't even realized he had been doing it until the pain it caused finally broke through. He blinked, and the darkness that had shrouded his thoughts lifted, registering the pain he was inflicting on himself to clear his head. He withdrew his hand from the tree, splinters lodging in his skin as he painfully uncurled his fingers, stiff from the constant force of impact they were under. His hand was shaking. No, he was shaking as he steadied his wrist with his other hand, noticing it was just as bad. Water dropped on his stained hands, smearing the dried-in blood and dirt. He looked up. It wasn't raining. He felt something cold and wet on the side of his face. He rubbed it away, only to discover his own tears. He was so lost in his thoughts would be one word for them, that he did not know where he was going. He didn't even register he had been punching the tree, nor why. His body, or something in him, had taken over, trying to inflict pain to drive away the dark thoughts, to establish some kind of control over himself. To put a stop to his own worst impulses. Only now after the fact did he realize that he so very desperately never wanted to think about such things again. Ever. He fell to his knees, continuing to shake, finally admitting to himself that he was, in fact, a monster. Not an opinion, but an actual, tangible fact. He had to forcibly control himself, to watch himself always, or else that would be him. That would be what he became, that would be what he would do to everyone around him. He'd become something less than human, less human than the world full of foreign races and species he now lived in. He'd become a debased creature who would tear open the throats of those who trusted him and watch them die in his embrace, reveling in it so long as he got what he wanted out of it. And that scared him more than anything else he could imagine. God, he said weakly through shuddering breaths, his mouth suddenly dry as his voice croaked. God, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. He said, fumbling at his breastplate, reaching up and into it through his gorget, pulling out the small chain and the cross upon it. The left arm of the cross had broken off at some point. He hadn't even noticed until now. Please, help me. I'm sorry, I don't really want these things. Please. He pleaded, the gentle rolling fog covering him up to his waist as he knelt there amidst the undergrowth. It's not my fault. He said more forcefully, a shaking hand taking off the helmet and letting it fall to the ground. It's not my fault, you can't blame me. He shouted, his voice carrying for some distance in the unearthly silence of the dark forest. I can't. It's the temptation. I can't be faulted for the temptation. It was put upon me. That was not my fault. That was not what I choose. He protested weakly. I don't act on it, not always. I put it out of my mind like I'm supposed to with every other sin. He gripped the cross in his unarmored hand more forcefully, imprinting it into his skin. His words sounded hollow to his own ears, in the face of what he saw within himself. What vileness he was capable of, what a part of him wanted, what he wanted. No. He said quietly, his voice soft, desperate. I'm sorry. I just want help. God, please. Why? Nothing stirred but the idle plant life in the gentle, almost non-existent breeze that flowed around him, the mist that sat with him rolling by peacefully, ignorant and uncaring of the storm of fear and despair raging in the heart and soul in their midst. Please, he begged, thoughts coming unbidden of those who he assaulted, and those he had killed. Justifications and rationalizations turned to ash in the face of the reality of the evil he had committed. The wind blew, the trees stirred, silence reigned in the wake of his voice. I'm so sorry. Author's note. ITT, vampires are bad people. End author's note.